Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to TENOR Boston 2023. My name is Anthony Greedis. I'm a professor here at Northeastern, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you here. Welcome to Boston. Welcome to this exciting conference. We have some really interesting and exciting presenters, and it will be kicked off with our first keynote presentation by Professor Morwaread Farbood. She is Associate Professor and Associate Director of Music Technology at the Department of Music and Performing Arts Professions at New York University. That's in the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. Professor Farbood worked for several years at the MIT Media Lab. She was one of the creator of HyperScore, which was kind of a game changer in looking at the way we think about sound in digital graphic environments. She is a forward thinker and the first person that I went to when I thought about who should we bring in and start to frame our focus on this conference here in Boston under the topic of representation and perception of music structure. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Morwaread Farbood.
Thank you, Tony, for the nice intro. And hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And today, I'm going to talk about the concept of musical tension. And I'm going to talk about musical tension from the perspective of two fields. So one is the field of music cognition and perception, and the second is the field of computer music. So in particular, what I'm interested in is the musical structures and the qualities or features in music that contribute to how people feel tension is changing while they're listening to music, and also how that might be represented visually. And in order to do that, I also have considerations on how to model this from a computational perspective. So I'm going to be talking about a whole range of projects related in this area, but that's kind of like the general gist of my talk. Okay, so what is musical tension and why do we care? I think this is a very important point to bring up. So let's start with a definition. So here's a qualitative way of looking at musical tension. So an increase in tension might be described as a feeling of building excitement or perhaps moving towards some kind of climactic point, or the heightening of the feeling that something is moving in a direction. However, the opposite of it would be maybe a feeling of relaxation or rest. So when tension decreases, you might feel a sense of resolution or calm. So the thing about tension is that it makes music interesting, right? If there's no tension, if the ebb and flow of tension is missing from the listener experience, music sounds kind of flat and not very interesting. Of course, I have to say that cultural norms and musical styles do change, and so that implies that factors influencing the perception of tension might be different depending on what those factors are. However, I would like to hypothesize that music in any style and from all cultures have this concept of tension, even if it's not actually defined. And of course, as many of you know, a good composer or a good performer is an expert at manipulating tension, right, to really engage the listener. Thinking from a theoretical perspective, the concept of tension really is a key concept in Western music theory, at least. And it's been connected to a number of cognitive or perceptual responses. So for example, the feeling of tension or the change in tension in music has been connected to emotional responses to music. And there's been a lot of past work, behavioral studies, but neuroimaging studies as well, that have looked at how different features in music contribute to this global sensation of changing tension. Okay, so I have run many experiments that explore how listeners perceive tension. However, I want to start with a project that Tony mentioned hyperscore, which I did quite a long time ago, but it really is the context for how my research on tension emerged. And I think it's also appropriate for this conference, given the focus on representation of music, in this case, graphical representations of music. And I want to connect that early work to the empirical work that I've been doing over the past years. So, to begin with, this is a screenshot of hyperscore. So this set the stage for a lot of the ideas I had moving forward when I was thinking about musical tension, when I was thinking about music perception in particular. And I developed this software a long time ago, but it was from the perspective of a composer originally. And the idea was hyperscore. I was interested in algorithmic composition, and hyperscore was meant to be a computer-assisted composition system that could produce music, could generate music based on this concept of tension, a graphical depiction of tension. So tension as drawn, say, in a contour or a curve. That was the original idea. However, it kind of turned into something else because I was working on a bigger project, and I had to sort of tailor the software to the particular project, which focused on actually children and children composing music. So that's why this aesthetic kind of looks the way it does. It's very colorful. It has this certain look and feel. Anyway, the point was, hyperscore became a software application, a graphical computer-assisted composition system that was designed for users who didn't necessarily have musical training. And the idea was there was this graphical language for describing musical structures. And the idea was that there'd be two kinds of input. So there'd be kind of low-level input, which was motivic material, which you could kind of see in the screenshot here, where is kind of piano roll notation here, where you have individual notes that form motives. And then higher levels of abstraction. So you sketch a piece out, and you can kind of see its shape by just visually looking at what you've drawn. So that was kind of what it turned out to be. But originally, the core concept was this idea of musical tension. So this was the initial prototype, which looks very different from what I just showed you. And that's really where I was coming from. So this prototype was an almost completely automated system. And the user input consisted of just a single tension line, which I don't know if you can really see it on the screen here, but it's that light green line, right? And then you see the red lines around it and a bunch of vertical blue lines. Well, the idea was that the user would simply draw a tension line, which would define the tension contour of a piece of music. And then for testing purposes, I put together a bunch of pre-composed motives. And the idea was that the user could select from a bunch of pre-composed motives. And that was pretty much it. The system would generate a piece of music based on that tension curve by parsing the tension curve for parabolic shapes and textures within those sections. So that's what the blue lines denote. They denote the parsing of that line. And would take the pre-composed material selected by the user and compose this piece of music. It was really, as I said, a prototype. It was a test case. Didn't really compose very interesting music, but it did kind of work in some ways. And at that point, I kind of started experimenting more with different graphical ways of expanding this because the application was not particularly interesting. And tension, is kind of a complex phenomenon. So I'm just going to talk quickly through these. This is another earlier version where I decided, well, why does time have to be the x-axis? Why don't I just draw a timeline and annotate that timeline, and that might be more interesting. Except it really wasn't more interesting. The problem is when you have this kind of random line that you draw, and then you draw a bunch of annotations. So the idea was that these pre-composed motives are mapped to colors, and then you draw in these colors to indicate, I want this kind of musical material at this point in the timeline. And then the computer just, does something based on this kind of basic input. So I realized, there's this kind of balance between user input and automation, right? How much control does a user have in an application like this? And the problem was not much. And so I started experimenting with other ways to give the user a bit more control, but kind of keeping this sort of abstract, free-form sort of drawing format. In this version, you can see these little lines indicating where the motivic material is actually inserted in this crazy timeline. And also you can see that the pre-composed material is now up to the user. They can put in anything they like. It was okay, but not great. And other things I tried, I decided, why have a constricted 2D space? Why not have an infinite plane where you could draw as many timelines as you like and and annotate them as you This was actually, in some sense, musically the worst version, because it didn't make much sense. But it was an interesting experiment, I would say, and it led to the final version. And okay, if you haven't noticed, there's another issue with these other versions since the prototype. And the issue is that what happened to the tension line, right? It's now just this kind of random timeline. There are like a bunch of colorful annotations. It looks maybe kind of cool, but it's not very interesting. So I kind of had gotten away from what I intended this thing to be. And so I went back to it and I said, okay, I gotta have tension depicted somehow in this application. And for me, that meant at least bringing back some features that might contribute to tension and draw them in a way that allows the system to contribute in a sort of automatic sense to the composition of the piece. So in this final version of Hyperscore, you have the pre-composed motives that could be of any length. You can see them here. You have the colors that you choose to map to the lines that you draw. I'm not going to get into the details of what the shapes of the lines mean, or the textures, but you can see that there's a central line in the middle, right? And also you can see that there's no randomly drawn timeline. The x-axis in this case is time. That was a practical choice, of course. And then this line in the middle, this kind of grayish blue line, became what I call the harmonic tension line. Since I couldn't kind of have a global one because I didn't really know what I was doing, I thought harmonic tension actually might be the way to go. Especially if you have novice users like kids, and they want to make their atonal composition sound, well, a little less atonal, maybe this is the way to go. So it was this optional feature where you could draw a functional harmonic timeline, or tension line, and what would happen is the system would parse this line, much like in the prototype, and determine what the sections were from a functional perspective. And I'm not going to get into what those sections were, but it was based on Western harmony. So these colorful bars in the back indicate the different functions of harmonic sections that are parsed from the harmonic tension line. So anyway, why am I talking about all this? Well, the point is, this is where my interest in empirical research in tension emerged from, because I was not happy with this. I mean, this kind of worked in a cool way, and it did what it kind of needed to do for the bigger project I was working on, but I was very dissatisfied with how tension was represented here, because I didn't know how to formally define global tension. I wasn't just interested in harmonic tension. So I started kind of taking a step back and thinking, okay, well, what's a more first principles approach to this problem? I really want a computational model of musical tension that I could use within a computer-assisted composition application. How do I do this? Well, I got to figure out how listeners perceive tension, right? I can't just assume that, something gets louder and the listener feels more tense, right? I mean, maybe that might be intuitive, but that doesn't mean that I should make these assumptions. So I also thought about all of the possible features contributing to tension, and I came up with kind of a dichotomy, I would say, that there are certain features that I would say are more low level. They're psychoacoustic, they're dependent on psychophysical factors. And on the other hand, there are more high level features of music that are cultural or stylistic that, are not universal to all music. So what I figured is that the more universal features would be the psychoacoustic features, and the higher level factors would be more style dependent. So that was kind of my feeling. Now, I started only with Western music because that's where my expertise lies. But, as I said, the model that I eventually came up with, which I'm going to talk about, is actually flexible enough that it's not necessarily style dependent. It depends on the features you input. So some of the psychoacoustic factors of tension I thought might be like loudness, like dynamics, right? Timbre, tempo, right? Those kind of expressive features, I would say. And some of the stylistic or cultural dependent, I would call them cognitive factors, might be harmony, melodic, and rhythmic structures. But I mean, this dichotomy is not necessarily a hard one, right? One could argue that harmony, for example, can fit to some extent in both categories, because functional harmony in Western tonality, I would say, is a cognitive factor, right? But what about dissonance, right? That's more of a psychoacoustic feature, but that's still important in Western harmony. So this is all to say that I was trying to, come up with this way of classifying the features, and this was the best I could come up with. Now, I would have to also say that there's this higher level of I suppose, way of looking at tension, which is that it's a reflection of perhaps a more fundamental cognitive process. It is dependent on memory, for example, to some extent, right? Especially if you have factors or features that change across time, maybe more than milliseconds, right? We're talking on the order of tens of seconds, like maybe harmony. And repetition on many temporal levels also reflects tension contours in music. And this has been shown in empirical research as well, where you have literal repetitions of an event, but you've also different scales of repetition. You have motives, for example, kind of on the small scale, and maybe phrases on the medium scale, and sections on a large scale. So thinking about the form of music, or the various types of forms, and good performers understand that, hey, I'm going to interpret this section maybe intuitively. I want this kind of tension contour, and it's based on the phrasing of the piece, or it's based on a certain repetition, or section that comes back maybe in a slightly different way, but has a slightly different contour with regard to tension. And of course, there's some other, I would say, musical and non-musical factors that need to be considered, which I don't consider in my model, but I just want to bring them up, which is expectation. So there is literal expectation, where you're listening to a piece of music, you hear certain things repeated, so you have certain expectations, or you've heard the music before, so you have those expectations, right? So that's going to influence how you feel tension. But also schematic factors, such as if you're hearing a piece that's that's tonal, it's Western harmony, you have certain expectations for how chords should resolve or whatnot. Even if you know what that piece is, you've already heard that piece and you know what it sounds like. So I had to consider expectation as well. Okay, so how do we model, given all these disparate features, how do we actually start to do this? And I decided that maybe all of these features that I'm talking about contribute to some degree, but the question is which one is more important? Is loudness more important than the direction of pitch, right? Maybe melodic contour or pitch height is important. But what is the relative importance of these features? And to take a step back, are these features, should they even be considered in the first place? So in order to answer this question, I embarked on a series of experiments, music perception experiments, and the stimuli for these experiments were designed to systematically isolate and combine these kind of basic features. And the goal was to first verify the impact of the features, and second, to gain some insight into their relative importance. Okay, so here is an example of some of the earliest, most basic stimuli that I had in these experiments, where I decided on a bunch of features. The ones listed here are the ones that I, in the end, decided I should start out with. Tempo, onset frequency. I guess onset frequency in some ways is texture, but kind of a simplified version of texture, or density. Loudness and dynamics, of course, pitch height or melodic contour, harmony, in this case, Western functional tonal harmony, and rhythmic alteration. So I decided I'd mess with rhythmic regularity, maybe syncopation, looking at metrical accents, things like that. So that's how I started out. And I wanted to first verify that these did actually contribute to tension. And I had the most basic, simple stimuli. So, for example, if I wanted to see if people thought tension was changing when tempo changed, I'd have something like this, where there's nothing else going on, but there's kind of accelerando or retard or whatever. And I'd ask the subjects or the participants in the experiment, is tension changing? And if so, how? Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? Is it staying the same? And so I'm just going to play a couple of these basic examples. So is it getting more tense, less tense? Is it changing at all? Okay, here's another hypothesis of mine. If there is change in sound or music, there is change in tension. That's kind of a theory of mine. Anyway, here's an example where just dynamics are changing. So, I mean, this is not exactly music, but the whole point is I'm really trying to understand the contribution of these basic factors. But then you have simple examples where maybe there's more going on and they're, two features kind of counteract each other. So in this case, you have tempo and loudness perhaps counteracting each other. Right, so what is the overall perception there of tension changing? And then I had a few what I called obvious examples, right, where you have a bunch of different features, I thought, moving in a very similar direction. So I would expect that the responses would be very uniform. It kind of leaves you hanging there, right? That was intentional. And I'm not going to play this last one, but it's very simple harmonic progression. But I put this here because it's actually kind of more complicated than you think it might be, because whenever you have harmony, you also have some kind of voice leading, right? You have melodic changes. Even if you don't mean them to be melodic, people perceive especially the highest voice as, well, a kind of a tune. So yes, it resolves at the end here, but the melodic contour keeps going up. And if a rise in melodic contour might contribute to increase in tension, but you have a resolution of the harmony, what does that mean? Like what is the overall result here? So these were kinds of the things I was exploring in the early experiments. I also looked at more complex features. For example, I mentioned melodic expectation. And I didn't invent my own model to find quantitative values for melodic expectation. I simply used what was out there already. In this case, Margulis's model on melodic expectation, which was based on some of Eugene Narmore's and Fred Lairdal's theories. So this was kind of a way, and as you can see, this graph over here is representative of one example where I calculated these melodic expectation values, and I had a quantified version of kind of a note-by-note basis on how expectation was changing. I also had to find a way of quantifying harmonic tension, which was the most complicated of all, I would say, and there was actually some overlap with melodic expectation. So, I mean, these features are not necessarily mutually exclusive, and that includes also melodic contour. In this case, I used Lairdal's tonal tension model. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but the idea is that when it comes to functional harmony, there's a hierarchy, right? Which means that the tension values are not based on individual chords, but they're based on how they're situated within a tonal context. So that's why you have this kind of tree structure where you're parsing from a hierarchical perspective the progressions. This is, I would do these analyses on reductions, of course, of the excerpts that I was presenting to subjects, to participants, and they got pretty complex, actually. Because if you had a longer example, then you had quite a complex structure, and all these values had to be calculated based on these tree analyses the local and global key areas for these excerpts. So there's a lot of analysis that went into it. It wasn't automated. Other features could be easily quantified, right? So for example, loudness, I use the psychoacoustic loudness model. I use some MATLAB library to do that. For melodic contour is pretty simple, right? It's like pitch height. Tempo is the same thing. It's kind of a one-dimensional feature that changes over time. It's not a problem to quantify. So this is what the data look like. So I ran a series of experiments after those basic ones that I talked about, where I'm presenting these features. I decide which features actually contribute, which don't. Okay, now I know, so I'm going to come up with another series of listening experiments where the participants have to judge tension in real time. So they're not just going to sit there and listen to something that's 3 seconds long and say, hey, tension changed, here's how it changed. But they'd have a slider on a screen, and they'd move it based on how they felt tension was changing in real time. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to take all these features, these quantified versions of these musical features that I had decided from my initial experiments did contribute to tension, and then input them into a model, ideally, and the model would output a tension prediction that hopefully matched the empirical data, so data from an experiment where real listeners are rating tension in real time. So that was the goal. So what you see here is what this looked like. So you have, the center line, the black solid line in the middle, right? And that is the mean or the average tension responses, continuous tension responses, from a whole bunch of participants, like 35, rating these excerpts multiple times. And the colorful lines represent the quantified versions of the features I was looking at. So I know it's kind of hard to see the legend because it's pretty small, but there's harmony, loudness, melodic expectation, onset frequency, pitch height of the inner voice, pitch height of the bass, and pitch height of the melody. So those are the ones that I used as input into the model. The point here is that you can see how complex these features are, right? It's not readily obvious that you look at those various features and say, hey, I know what the tension is going to be like in this piece, right? I mean, it's too complicated. Okay, I'm going to make this quick. I tried kind of a basic classic method at first because I noticed that in prior work on tension, regression models had been used to understand how individual features are correlated to tension responses. So I thought, hey, why don't I take a machine learning approach to this? I'll use, some of the data to train a regression model and then use the rest of the data to test the model to see how well it worked. Well, it worked terribly. So this figure over here shows the empirical data, so the mean tension response by listeners as a solid line for one of the excerpts. This is about a minute-long excerpt. I think it was a Brahms piano concerto excerpt. And the dotted line is the tension model prediction, so the regression model's prediction. What you see here is the vertical line separates the training data and the test data. So obviously it fits the empirical data really well, right, when it's trained on it, right? In this case, this is a quadratic model because I tried both linear and nonlinear models. But when it's tested, it just kind of blows up. It's terrible. So the point is, regression models, no. Forget about the regression models. And I think the primary problem with the regression approach was that these models are unable to capture the moment-by-moment listening experience, right? This is not what they're for. So one of the things I have talked about already, and which I noted in my previous experiments, was the importance of trends. Right? People listen to music, and you tend to hear when things change in kind of a continuous manner, right? You hear a crescendo. That's kind of ear-catching, right? Or you might hear a scalar pattern that goes up. Right? That's kind of an obvious pattern that might draw your attention. And so I decided that I would use this concept of attention that's focused on trends or clear trends and changes in the music, changes in the features of the music, and use that as a way to come up with a computational model that made more cognitive sense to me. So this idea of what I'm calling trend salience formed the basis for this model. So this model includes three major components. It includes an attentional window that models a perceptual moving window in time, and that window extracts a current tension trend, whatever that is. I'm going to talk more about the tension trend in a moment. And then there's a memory window, which is defined simply as the direction of the tension trend before this attentional window, so immediately preceding the attentional window. So this, what I think of as a temporal model, essentially defines tension as a function of musical features by estimating the combined directional change of all the features in each of these attentional window, so the sliding window, and uses this information to generate the tension predictions. So this combined directional change or tension trend for the attentional window has to be weighted by both what immediately precedes it in the memory window as well as the perceptual weights of each feature, right? Well, let's go back to like, oh, is loudness more important or is tempo more important or whatever, right? And the thing is, based on the earlier experiments, I was able to come up with some, as I would say, fairly rough weights, but good enough for what I was doing here. And of course, I needed to optimize the memory and attentional window sizes. So what I did was I explored various window durations. So 0 to 8 seconds for the memory window, 1 to 8 seconds for the attentional window. And so in this figure, what you see are different colored lines that represent these different memory window sizes. So the x-axis represents the attentional window sizes, and the y-axis represents the correlation between the model using those window sizes and creating a prediction to the actual empirical data. So obviously, the higher the correlation, or R value, the better. So perfect correlation would be 1. So what you see is that there's a flat gray line in the middle, which is kind of interesting, right? This is the 0-second memory window. And what's interesting is that, the results vary so little when there's no memory window at all. And the optimal model performance appears to be up here. Where's my pointer here? Okay, here we go. Right here. So which is about a 3-second attentional window and a 3-second memory window. So that's what I ended up using. Okay, so the bottom line is that unlike the regression models, the performance of my optimized trend salience models was very good. I was very happy with this. And here's one example. So here's that Brahms concerto excerpt from before that I showed you with the regression model. So what you have the empirical data with the solid line, the predicted tension data, with the dotted line, and you can see it does a pretty good job of predicting tension patterns for this very complex excerpt, Brahms excerpt. Okay, so at this point, I was satisfied that I had a viable computational model of tension. So what next? Okay, so you might be asking now, well, what about timbre, right, which is a very important feature. I had intentionally left out timbre as a feature to explore in those earlier experiments because it was just too complex. There's too much going on. And I needed something very basic to develop a model to begin with before I branched out and explored timbre. And the very simple stimuli I used in those experiments, the timbre didn't really change. It was just like one instrument sound maybe, and that was it. So it was not a factor. So, but now I did want to explore timbre, and I wanted to see if this model that I'd come up with, the trend salience model, could be used in cases where timbre was the primary driver of musical tension, which is the case for certain styles of music, right? So I had to figure out, okay, so what timbre attributes are worth exploring? Because there are so many of them, right? And they're not, there's an overlap between some of them. It's very difficult to have like completely orthogonal features, timbral features to provide for a model. So I came up with 5, which I've listed here: inharmonicity, roughness, spectral centroid, spectral deviation, and spectral flatness. And I chose these for a number of reasons. Namely, because these are features that commonly come up in the music information retrieval literature, or MIR literature, and they've been commonly utilized in various music information retrieval applications, like differentiating instrumental timbres, things like that. So I thought, okay, these are the features I want to look at. So inharmonicity, I mean, this, I don't know how many of you are familiar with these terms, so I'm going to just define them a little bit. So inharmonicity is based on how partials of a sound are offset from integer multiples of the fundamental frequency of a pitch. So bells have high inharmonicity, for example, while flute has not so high inharmonicity. And then there's roughness, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and it's also known as sensory dissonance. And it's present when pairs of sinusoids are close enough, or partials are close enough in frequency such that the listener experiences a beating sensation. Well, how many minutes do I have?
10 more minutes, we have some time for questions.
Oh, okay. I better skip a whole bunch of slides. And I planned it for an hour, but I didn't think about the questions. Okay, 10 minutes. All right. Okay. Okay. I'm gonna. Yeah, this is. Okay. You know, I'm gonna just skip over all of this. There were a bunch of features, timbral features, and then I ran an experiment. The experiment worked. And it showed that the features contributed to, I will play these examples though. So basically I had these 5 features. I had different levels of the features. High level of inharmonicity, low level of inharmonicity. So state A, state B. I played static sounds with those 2 different states. And I asked listeners, hey, did the tension increase or decrease? And I, different orders, and sometimes they stayed the same. I had different fundamental frequencies that I explored, so different pitch registers. So here's one example of inharmonicity. So this goes from low inharmonicity to high inharmonicity. Oh, shoot, hold on. Here's an example of roughness. So this also goes from high to low. Actually, all these examples do. It's funny feedback. Maybe there's something wrong. The sound doesn't sound quite right. I think the attack sounds strange. I don't know if it's a system or not.
Compressor, actually, a gradual fade in.
Oh, is that why? Okay, well, it didn't sound quite like that. The attacks were very sharp in the actual experiment. Here's a change in spectral centroid. Change in spectral deviation. And change in spectral flatness. So these are all synthesized sounds, right? They're all artificial. In summary, overall, there was positive evidence for contributions for all of these attributes. I'm not going to get into the details of some of the issues because there is correlation between those features. But what was interesting is this concept of noisiness as tension building, because I would say spectral flatness kind of corresponds to this idea of noisiness, is kind of intuitive, right? For example, there's a great deal of literature on environmental sound and environmental noise and how it's tension inducing. It's like psychological stress, right? In the case of inharmonicity and roughness, I'm not surprised that they are both contributors to tension because they're associated with dissonance, right? Which is, of course, an important concept in music. And roughness in particular is one factor that has been previously indicated in prior work. So on the other hand, there was a slightly ambiguous response to spectral centroid, which did surprise me, because spectral centroid is often associated with brightness of sound, right? And there's this kind of, I suppose you could say that if a sound gets brighter, maybe it gets more tense. I mean, there clearly was some contribution, but as I said, it was less clear than the other features. And And some prior work has shown that brighter instruments are perceived as more tense, but then there's like other work on emotion and music in particular where there is no association between increase in tension and increase in brightness. Okay, so this is all to say that at this point I felt spectral centroid was more of a question mark than the other features. Okay, so to recap, I conducted a bunch of timbre experiments. I was happy with what happened. I had some features now that I could use. Now I wanted to actually use real music. And I wanted continuous tension responses, just like I had in my previous experiments, and also be able to model them using my transsalience model. So real music in this case included 2-minute, 30-second excerpts from electronic compositions by Stockhausen, Nono, and Tae-Hung Park. And the idea was to evaluate how the different timbral features that I just talked about contributed to tension by utilizing my transsalience model. So, I figured that by using this model, I could also optimize parameter values, in which case things like weights, as well as the memory and attentional windows, to shed some light on how individual features, in this case timbral features, contribute to musical tension. And I also had another form of motivation for this, and this harkens back to my original interest in visual representations of tension, and this, within the context of hyperscore, the computer-assisted composition system. So one example of how, and this is all, you all know this, of how effectively music can manipulate tension is found in film scores, right? And I once had a student who ran this really interesting experiment where he showed the opening sequence to this horror film, very famous Stanley Kubrick film, The Shining, and he replaced the music. So he had 3 different versions of the music. So one was kind of ominous. It wasn't dies irae, but it was, it was still pretty ominous. Another one's kind of cheerful and bouncy, and the other one was jazzy and sort of chill, I would say. And I don't really remember much about the experiment, except it was kind of fun to experience, to listen and watch, the stimuli. But the point here is that for my experiment, I wanted to explore how visual tension might interact with auditory and musical tension. So I had to find visual, now obviously like with a film, right? There's a lot going on film. And in fact, a lot of prior studies on audiovisual tension tend to focus on high-level or artistic elements, right? So, film music and its effect on story interpretation. So there's like semantic component, and like my student and The Shining scene or the sequence. But I wanted to avoid these semantic associations. I wanted to make sure that I had timbre, which is the kind of more low-level features of music, and corresponding analogs in the visual domain that were more abstract. So I had to pick visual features that I felt were more universal and less culturally influenced without any kind of semantic context. So the auditory features that I used to model the musical excerpts were loudness, onset frequency, or in this case it's more like density or textural density, I would say. Timbre, those 5 features that I talked about. And for the visual features, I came up with 4 based on vision perception research. And they were speed of motion, coherence of motion, brightness, and contrast. So the visual part of the experiment consisted of different types of changes in the visual parameters. So there was one condition was no visuals at all. So you just hear the music, it's just a black screen, nothing going on visually. The animations that I came up with were designed to reflect, I guess, 3 general types of changes. So one was just random changes. The other one was gradual trends, so going back to my transsalience model. And finally, more complex trends and more, abrupt changes at some points and more smooth changes at other times. And how I visualized these changes was through something called a random dot kinematogram, also used in vision research. And the idea is that the number and size of the dots were generated to take up exactly half of the available screen space. So in order to allow for an equal proportion of the dots, which were moving around on the screen, and the background, so foreground, background, because I wanted to alter the brightness of both. So here's a screenshot of what the visuals look like. This is actually, I suppose, in debug mode, because you can see information about the stimulus here. But you can see that there's this tension slider. So listeners or viewers are experiencing the stimuli in real time, and they're continuously rating tension while they're doing so. And it's a freeze frame, of course, so you can't see the dots moving around, but it had a very organic feel. I mean, they were all moving around. When there was higher coherence levels, more of the dots would kind of move in the same direction. If there was higher brightness, the dots would get brighter. If there was higher contrast, then the contrast between the background and the foreground would be greater. Okay, so just because we're running short on time, I'm going to skip over this, but I do want to play some of the audio excerpts just so you know what they sounded like. Not all of it, of course, because it's too long, but just to give you an idea. So here's one of the excerpts. This one is from an excerpt of a piece by Tae-Hung Park. Okay, and here's a part of an excerpt from a piece by Stockhausen. And finally, the no-no excerpt. Okay, so you get an idea of what the audio sounded like. All of the three audio excerpts were paired with all of the three animations, but they were also presented alone, so audio only and visual only as well. So just to summarize, the idea was I would use my model to optimize the feature weights, because I wanted to see what's more important in the visual domain versus the auditory domain. Do these visual features actually contribute? Like, can I use my model for just the visual features as well? Because I had this idea that tension is very fundamental to how we perceive the world. It's not just in music. And I felt that there was a chance that there's this cross-domain effect, where the same kind of this idea of having trend salience could also transfer to visual features as well. And as the results of the experiment showed, this was the case. I'm going to skip over this, as I said. This is just an example of the audio-only results, where on the left-hand side, you have all of the features, and the black line in the middle is the empirical data. And then here you have the tension model prediction. So you have in blue the empirical data, and then you have in red the tension prediction for all 3 excerpts. And you can see they're very complex excerpts, right? These are not, basic, simple static changes in timbre. So the models actually did very well. And what was interesting also, I'm going to skip over this, the visual results were actually not bad. I don't think they were as good as the audio results, given these features, which is kind of a limited set of visual features, the predictions were actually fairly good. You can see here. And so again, on the left, you have the features, and on the right, the empirical data and the model predictions. Now, the most interesting part, of course, is the audiovisual results. And so when I modeled the audiovisual results, I retained in the audio-only and visual-only models only the features that were relevant. So I'm not going to get into how I did that. It was basically like a kind of similar to a regression approach, where I optimized the model by taking out certain features, starting with a complex model and kind of reducing it. Okay, 1 minute? Okay. But anyway, the point is loudness was the most important factor by far. And you can tell by the weights here, and it was by far the most important, followed by, interestingly, spectral centroid roughness, onset frequency, and speed of motion. And contrast. There was some effective contrast, but coherence and brightness contributed actually kind of a negative effect. Oops, my screensaver went on. That's bizarre. Sorry, I'm trying to log back into my... Okay, so let me wrap this up since I have 30 seconds. Okay, so yeah, here's the one example of the audiovisual results. You have all of these features here, and you have the model prediction and the empirical data here. Right, so let me conclude quickly. I think perhaps the most interesting result of this audiovisual experiment was the fact that the audio had a much stronger effect on the subject judgments than the visual component. So when it was optimized to fit the mean responses, as you saw, loudness was the most important factor, followed mostly by a bunch of timbral features. So overall, I was also looking at the windows, the actual attentional window sizes. They're quite short. And that's not surprising, given that we're kind of talking about low-level features here, right? This is not like functional harmony. So they're all generally under 3 seconds. And I think the important thing here is that these studies, there's nothing necessarily conclusive about all this. They're part of a series of ongoing studies, an ongoing exploration that has both a scientific and a creative component. And I've been thinking about creative applications for a long time, all the way going back to hyperscore, which was the context for how this work got started in the first place. And the trend salience model was originally intended to be incorporated into a computer-assisted composition system, so that was its purpose. I think the visual aspects that I've presented and I've explored and modeled highlight the fact that there is also this visual analog to tension, to musical tension. I'm hoping that this work will help us better understand musical tension, not just from a purely auditory perspective, but also cross-domain applications and how it might be part of an audio-visual experience as well. Okay, thank you.
So much. So I think we have at least time for at least one question, depending on how complex the question is. Would anybody like to ask a question? Yes, sir.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this interesting talk.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you very much for this interesting talk. One question. How do you position your results to the phenomenon of the cultural dependence of attention? Because in good horror films, the horror is when nothing happens.
Right.
When there is no tension, there is tension. Or what about the Ryder prelude? You have if at major chord nothing happens,
yeah,
and something should happen, is it tension or is it not tension?
That's a very good point. That is actually another kind of specific tension, which I didn't talk about here. But yeah, silence in films in particular has very important purposes, right? That the absence of sound itself can make a huge difference, but it depends on the context, right? If you have, for example, a big orchestra piece and there's a diminuendo and all of a sudden there's silence, that's a very different effect than, say, a horror film where it's like silent for a really long time. Then you have like a jump scare or something where there's sudden sound. But in terms of the Rheingold example, that is an example where things get tense because nothing is changing, right? Because at some point, like if you do something too long, you expect change. So that expectation builds tension. But that is actually not represented in this model at all. And I think the model that I'm presenting is actually better for more local changes in tension. Yes, it's meant to be like, okay, you take a whole piece of music and you input it and you get this tension prediction, but really, it's the local changes that it captures.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we do need to move on. We're going to have a transition for the next presentations. Another round of applause for our keynote speakers.
Thank you.